Okay, this video is called Civil War Art, and I'll show you where this sort of was coming from. You know, I grew up in the United States my whole life. I'm 60 years old, and I can remember when I was a kid, the South had this tremendous love of their generals and their Civil War heroes. You know, I had gone to a public school and a Catholic school in the North, and I was always taught, you know, the Civil War was just a way to stop slavery because the evil South had slaves, and of course that had to happen, and to preserve the Union, and we could care less about it. There was no emotional connection to it whatsoever. But I saw that people from the South, and I had heard from friends who had gone on vacation in the South, there would be like plastic replicas of all the Civil War generals for sale at 7-Eleven and stuff, and Southerners had this intense pride and sort of love of the Southern Confederates, okay? And I didn't understand that at all, but I didn't care. I didn't pay attention to it. And I also noticed things like, you know, when I watched Scooby-Doo, they would talk about this guy, General, you know, P.T. Beauregard. And, you know, I thought it was just kind of funny because his name sounded funny the way they would say it, Beauregard, you know, sort of a French name he's from Louisiana. But anyways, what I'm getting into here is a lot of things became clear about what the Civil War was all about and why it ends up actually being pretty interesting. And the art is beautiful. Also, you know, I read a lot of Irish history. And this guy, Thomas Meagher, he was originally, you know, arrested by the British for the troubles in 1848 in Ireland, okay, with Britain. And he was sent into like a prison colony in Australia. He was going to be executed. He somehow survived. He came to the United States. He became a general. He was a great general for the North in the Civil War. Thomas Meagher, right up in here. And, you know, these paintings are beautiful. These are the paintings of Mort Kunstler. Mort Kunstler and Don Troiani are the two best Civil War artists. I would say that Troiani, I'll show you his paintings in just a moment, is a little bit more historically accurate. But Mort Kunstler conveys the emotion better. So here's the Irish Brigade of the North. Okay, and the paintings are spectacular. Okay, so here's Thomas Meagher, and this is the book that I had read about him. It's a great book. It's called The Immortal Irishman by Timothy Egan. And this is Thomas Meagher, and he was a very brave guy. I mean, these guys were so brave compared to modern people. It's not even funny. They weren't afraid to risk their life at all, right out on the front lines, you know, for honor. Okay, that sense of honor was strong in them. He later on became a governor. He did some interesting things. Okay, then I also had recently read Ben Hur, A Tale of the Christ by Lew Wallace. This was one of the most famous books, you know, perhaps the most famous book of the 1800s in the United States. And it's a long book. The movie was fantastic. The book was good, but the movie was much better. And it came out of this guy right here, Lew Wallace. He's from Indiana. He was a lawyer, and then he became a major general for the North. And he was a very brave guy, but he got in trouble with Grant regarding the Battle of Shiloh. There was allegedly he had screwed up his instructions, miscommunicated, and went to the wrong spot, and the North suffered terrible casualties in the Battle of Shiloh, and it was blamed on him. Okay, so that was the stink of it. And it reminded me of what had happened to Thucydides. What had happened to Thucydides in the Peloponnesian War. I'll show you Thucydides. So Thucydides was this Greek admiral who was blamed for having screwed up something on the side of the Athenians in the Peloponnesian War between Athens and Sparta. And, you know, he was humiliated. And out of his humiliation, he wrote The History of the Peloponnesian War. It's one of the greatest historical books ever written. It's the greatest Greek historical book ever written. And what I'm trying to say is Lew Wallace did the same thing. He had been humiliated, disgraced. But instead of just, you know, retiring and accepting this unfair label put upon him, he wrote, you know, one of the greatest books of all time, Ben Hur, okay? So I like that when an individual is treated unfairly, disrespected, disgraced, shamed, insulted, scorned, ostracized, and they come back and they write a magnificent book. I think that's very admirable. So I really liked what, you know, Lew Wallace had done. I really liked what Thucydides had done to write a masterpiece. Because quite often, it's the people who are ostracized that have the ability to see things from more than one perspective and can thus write something that's objectively magnificent. So this is just one of many great quotes by Thucydides. Haste and anger are to my mind the two greatest obstacles to wise counsel. Haste, this usually goes with folly. Anger is the mark of primitive and narrow minds. Yeah, I've met a lot of people in my life. When you're dealing with somebody who's always angry, you're dealing with a bully, and they're like sending you a message. Yes, I'm angry, and if you don't do what I say, I'm going to be even more angry. How you like that? It's a way that they bully other people, and that's the kind of person you want to avoid them as best you can. I'm all too familiar with them, unfortunately. Okay. Oh, he's got lots of other great quotes. Thucydides, he also said, my history is not written for the immediate moment, for the popularity of the contemporaries. No, it is written for all time. It's a great quote. He's got lots of stuff like that. Thucydides, I would actually say one last word on Thucydides. I think everybody, if you only read one thing by Thucydides, you should read the history of the Melians. What happened to Milos? What Athens did to Milos? Everyone should know that, okay? There's a lot of other great stuff from Thucydides. And Thucydides, by the way, was liked very much by Nietzsche. Nietzsche. Okay, he loved the way Thucydides was so bleak and stark and realist, and he didn't call in the gods to explain things, unlike the earlier Greek historian Herodotus. So Nietzsche loved him. I like saying Nietzsche better than Nietzsche, even though Nietzsche is more proper. So Nietzsche loved him because he was objective and accurate, saw him as like the Machiavelli of the ancient Greeks. But what I loved him for is what I just told you. I loved him for being a man who's resilient, and he bounces back, and he can still create an artistic masterpiece despite being shamed and ostracized. So I thought that was magnificent. And in a sense, that's what Ben Hur did in the story. Ben Hur himself had been treated unfairly, disgraced, shamed, and brutalized, and he came back and he was a heroic figure, a good figure. So I like people because, in life you get smashed down. That's a normal thing that happens in life. And, to be able to bounce back from it, that's good. Okay, so then I saw the movie Gone with the Wind, and I couldn't believe how good it was. It's one of the greatest movies of all time. It's not even good. It's spectacular. It's 3.5 hours long, and I was like, how am I going to watch a 3.5 hour movie? That sounds so boring, But I didn't want it to end. You want it to go on and on. I'm currently reading the book, Gone with the Wind. And, I read tons of audiobooks in terms of listen to them. Usually they're about 10 hours long. Gone with the Wind's 49 hours long. And it's magnificent. What I like so much is it's written by a woman. It's written by Margaret Mitchell. And this is Scarlett O'Hara, which really is Margaret Mitchell herself. Margaret Mitchell's father worked for the Atlanta Historical Society, and because of that, she knows the historical information backwards and forwards. It's a masterpiece. And that's the best way to learn history is from these family historical novels. And then to correlate it with the dates. Because in school, you learn a bunch of dates and you forget everything. It doesn't mean anything. But when you learn it from the history of a family and from the people, you really get it. And Scarlett O'Hara is an Irish family, and I'm half Irish on my father's side. So I could really, it all rang true. And the psychology of it is magnificent. Almost every book I read is written by a man about men. So to read a book by Margaret Mitchell about a woman, Scarlett O'Hara, it was really interesting, the psychology. For example, Scarlett O'Hara is about to lose her farm, Tara, and she needs $300, and she has nowhere to get it. Rhett Butler had been imprisoned by the North, so he can't give it to her. Ashley's broke. He can't help her out. No one can help her. So she goes to find a husband, and she finds Frank Kennedy, and he was a wealthy guy who liked her sister, and she basically seduces him to get his money. And she says a great line in there, "Oh, men are so conceited. They believe anything when you flatter them. You can manipulate them into anything." And I'm like, oh my God, that's like my wife, how she chumped me. Anyways, I wish I'd read that book earlier. Maybe I would have been a little wiser. So anyways, here is Scarlett O'Hara with Rhett Butler, Clark Gable. You can't see it so well, but here is Melanie Hamilton with Ashley Wilkes. And man, Melanie Hamilton's like a saint. I'll do a separate talk about her later, but she reminded me of my mother. She's so good. There's a quote, too, I'll read from the book. Not today, but another time. It's magnificent. This is some of the greatest creative literature ever made in the history of the world. It's so good, I couldn't believe it. Okay, now, then also, again, I was taught, that Lincoln was this great hero, that, he saved the Union, he freed the slaves, what a great man. But then I kept hearing all these bad things about him from people in the South and other people, and I never really paid much attention, but I had a little bit of time, and I went through this stuff by Thomas Lorenzo, this book, and I'm like, holy crap, Lincoln was a total jerk. The only reason he started the Civil War, well, actually, Douglas MacArthur, the World War II general, the guy who went back to the Philippines, he had said, what causes war? Undefended wealth. And basically, the South could not defend itself in reality against the North. The North was like 5 times as big. It had all these mercenary soldiers coming in from Europe who had just paid, and it was a war of attrition. And the North would just, Grant was a butcher. He's a piece of crap general. He'd just send his guys on a frontal charge, and he would lose tons of guys. But he'd say, so what? We got more guys than they do. So they're really kind of like almost disgusting. And Lincoln, did his best. He didn't care at all about the slaves. That's all BS. That all came up later as a way to make him look like a good guy. But it had nothing to do with it. He wanted his tariff money. The South was paying them tons of tariffs. They doubled the cost on the tariffs. And the South's like, that's not fair. It's taxation without representation. We're back in 1776. Only 2% of Southerners owned slaves. It was not about the slaves. That came later as a pretext to try to make them look good. Okay, so anyways, thought that was interesting. And I had seen some of these paintings, especially, initially when I was reading all about Meagher and the art, and I'm like, gosh, they're really good. So here's the guys, these are the Irish guys that fought on the side of the rebels. And like in typical, and this is by Mort Kunstler again, he's I think, him and Troiani are the two best ones. They're both magnificent artists. You can just look at the painting, it's magnificent. So anyways, the stupid Irish, as usual, are fighting against each other, and, causing loss of life amongst other Irishmen. It's so stupid. The art is beautiful. And the Irish are very brave. The old joke about the Irish is there's drinkers and thinkers and more drinkers than thinkers. Okay, so here is the Irish who fought for the North with the Irish Brigade, and this is a Don Troiani painting. And you can see it's just magnificent, both the historical accuracy, the beauty of the drawing, the realism of it. It's magnificent. And, and both sides were brave, but, the North was just kind of stupid. Right when he declared war, Lincoln immediately, took away habeas corpus, and he imprisoned tens of thousands of people. Lincoln was a total tyrant. He was a total asshole. The more you study Lincoln, the more you'll hate him. Because, in history, he gets kind of portrayed as a good guy, and he's kind of liked by people who like centralization, because what he did was he destroyed states' rights, okay? And also, he made it clear that, okay, this is just sort of the same painting from the other side. Here was one, I forget the name of it was Corcoran, I think, was the Irish, an Irish colonel. That was what this painting was in the artillery. Here's the Irish Brigade in the Civil War. All right, there. I'm going to get to more good stuff here in a sec here. Oh yeah, I like this painting, just transposing them as being opposite of each other. The guys fighting for the South, the guys fighting for the North, and the Irish, causing loss of life amongst Irish. Stupid Irish, always doing stuff like that. Okay, here is a pretty good painting here. It's called Recognition by Constant Meagher. And the story is that the Southern guys just killed the Northern guy in this painting. And he gets up close to look at him, and he recognizes it's his brother. And that's kind of like the whole war of the South. Of course, they should have freed the slaves, but they could have easily done that without a war. They didn't need a war in other countries to free the slaves, like in England. It was stupid. I think the South was eventually just going to go bankrupt because they weren't sustainable, their economy. So anyways, in the Civil War, the South had like no industrial. All they had was cotton, okay? The North was able to take over the rivers, bottle them up, shut down the sales of cotton, had tons more industrial production of equipment, endless number of soldiers coming in from Europe. The South never really had a chance. The South thought they did because they were foolish. They were sort of very brave, and that's partly why the Southern people loved them. And you got to remember, the North invaded their home, okay? The South didn't go and burn down northern towns and rape the women. No, that's what the North did to the South. Here's just another painting of the Irish Brigade, this one by Don Troiani, and again, magnificent paintings. Okay, and then here is the Celtic cross, like a circle, like the sun. You got a little three-leaf clover there in the center of it, the Trinity. But that's a very Celtic Irish symbol there. This is a monument to the Irish Brigade who died at Gettysburg in the Civil War, which was from 1861 to 1865. Oh, here's just one more painting of General Thomas Meagher fighting. So he was very beloved by the Irish, okay, and by the North. He's a very brave general. Here's a painting of the Indiana Regiment, the Black Hats. And this, I don't know for sure if Lew Wallace was in this, but it reminded me of Lew Wallace. This is, again, the author of Ben Hur by Don Troiani. And again, they said he screwed up at Shiloh, screwed up his orders, didn't get to the battle where he should have been on time, and because of that, the North suffered big casualties. That was the disgrace of Lew Wallace, who then came back and wrote Ben Hur, The Tale of the Christ, a magnificent novel, the most popular novel of the 1800s. And then you think about it, then in the 1900s, Gone with the Wind was written by Margaret Mitchell, and that was the most popular novel of the 1900s. You know, if you adjust it for time, the movie was all-time biggest grossing movie if you adjust it for time with inflation, and the book was spectacular. You know, back then people too had the patience, 1,000 pages long, and it's an incredible masterpiece. Okay, and I like it best because of psychology. You know, for me, men are easy to understand. Women are more difficult to understand. That book is constantly Scarlett O'Hara, you know, bitching and conniving, and even though she's kind of a sneaky bitch, she's very clever and funny and kind of adorable too at the same time. It's a magnificent book. It's great. The whole thing is great from start to finish. And again, because her father worked for the Atlanta Historical Society, Margaret Mitchell just totally captures it, as good as it could be put into words in all the historical events of the Civil War. That's the book students should read. They'll never forget the Civil War if they read that book. Maybe that's why they don't want them to read it. Anyways, here is the charge, the rebel yell, the Confederates. This one's by Sidney Edmondson. Okay, and you look at the Confederates. The more you study them, the more you realize how pathetic they were. They didn't have equipment. Many of them didn't have shoes. They would wrap their shoes and they would just wrap a rag around their foot and tie it, and that would be their shoe. They didn't have equipment. They were really pathetic. This is Bedford Forrest, and he was a very brave, spectacular cavalry man. And this is just him on one of his charges. So they were, the North was deep in their territory, deep in their homeland, and was burning down people's houses, RAPE the women, looting the family homes, stealing everybody's property. And the Southerners loved them because this was their only hope to survive and not have everything destroyed and be taken from them. And he made all these brave cavalry rides in the middle of the night, did all kinds of brave things. The Southerners were very brave and daring. The North was kind of boring in comparison. They mostly just basically came in with markedly superior numbers, etc., and just, won by attrition. Okay, here is another painting. This one is, I forget the name of this one. It's by Don Troiani as well. But you see the close quarters of it, the idea of the Southern Cross. The whole thing is just kind of sad. And then this is the other thing that you get from from Gone with the Wind. This whole idea of, Southern belle with the Southern dashing officer saying goodbye to her as he rides off to defend the hometown. And there's sort of the spectacular scenery and beauty of it. But almost all of these guys ended up dead or just prisoners. They all ended up, and you've Gone with the Wind, you hear them, they all come back. They've been starving to death. They've got lice all over themselves. It's really sad, and it's really screwed up. Okay, here's another painting by Don Troiani. These are the men of Arkansas at the Battle of Shiloh. And the Shiloh was a disaster. I mean, both the North and the South really, it's a common problem in wars that the tactics have not caught up with the equipment. And so basically their tactics were kind of primitive, a lot of, bayonets on the rifles and just frontal en masse charges and just tons and tons of guys. They hadn't learned anything significant from Napoleon, not much. So anyways, it was just, the casualties were off the charts. I think the total casualties were around 800,000. They're more than what a lot of books will tell you 600,000, but that's not true. Yeah, and also, a lot of what people know about is the Ken Burns documentary, which has a lot of good photographs, but he's full of BS. He tries to say, like, Lincoln was the greatest president ever. What a crock of BS that was. He totally gives it from the North are the hero's side point of view, and that's not an accurate story of what happened. Okay, here's another painting by Don Troiani on the front lines. And just look at the spectacular art here. You can see that they're basically being encircled, and they're fighting on over here. They're fighting over here. Here's the South coming in. Here's the North flag. Here's the South flag. Okay, and here's Jeb Stuart. This is from 1862 by Don Troiani. And again, the South loved these guys. They were the heroes that were saving their homes. After this battle is lost, the Northerners are going to come in here, take all the property out of this house. They're going to burn the place down, RAPE the women. So, for the South, this was the only thing standing between them and complete destruction. And these guys really were brave, and they really were heroic. Despite being totally outnumbered and outsupplied, they hung in there for a long time. But, they should have just never started this. They should have never gone to war with the North. They had no chance of winning. These are Morgan's Raiders, Southerners on a dangerous mission. This is another one by Mort Kunstler. And this is kind of it. Will you volunteer to go behind enemy lines and do all this dangerous stuff? And they were really brave. That's why it's sort of like glamorous and dashing. And also, they were right next to their families. They were the home front was them. Here's Stonewall Jackson saying goodbye to his wife and his child. Okay, and he was killed in the Battle of Chancellorsville. Even though it was a great victory for Lee and for the South, losing him, he was the second in command in a sense, with Robert E. Lee. Okay, but you get the sense of this is their home. The Northerners are far, far from home. Okay, and lots of the Northerners are just these mercenaries that don't even speak English. Okay, here's General Lee watering his horses. And you get the sense that, the people, they love the guy. Okay, he's protecting them. Lee had slaves, which he set them free. Okay, unlike Lincoln, his wife had inherited slaves. He sold the slaves. Okay, he didn't set them free. Lee was against slavery. The reason he led the South in the Civil War was because they had invaded Virginia. Okay, he was defending his homeland. He was a graduate, West Point, and he knew a lot of the Northern generals. Okay, but I think what this conveys is the people loved these guys. That's why they loved their history. That's why they loved their officers, their men. When the Gone with the Wind talks about all this, that after the Southerners lost, they would retreat, and they would just go into random houses, and people would feed them and take care of them. So that was their families. It was a very different story than the South, where the North was just went way down into the South and destroyed the place, basically. But you also see how spectacular and beautiful this art is. I mean, it's stunning how great this art is. This is by Southern Generals by Mort Kunstler again. Okay, so it's really good art. Here's Stonewall Jackson with Robert E. Lee, and this is before the Battle of Chancellorsville, and this is again by Mort Kunstler. You can kind of tell when it's by Kunstler. It's got this aesthetic beauty to it. Okay, so here's another Mort Kunstler. These are the generals meeting, there's Stonewall Jackson, Robert E. Lee, Jeb Stuart, and some of the other ones. Okay, this is Stonewall Jackson at Chancellorsville. This one is done by Don Troiani. And so Don Troiani, he's a real, artist expert of all the historical stuff. He's historically perfect, one of the greatest historical artists who ever lived. He's done tons of books and stuff related not only to the Civil War, but to other wars too, and he's spectacular, Don Troiani. Okay, here is the boy colonel, and part of what this is all about is the South had a total shortage of men. The reason why the North could fight by attrition is if they lose 10,000 guys, so what? They got another 100,000 around the corner. It was no big deal. But when the South lost a guy, it didn't have a replacement for him. And they were already outnumbered to begin with, 5-1. So they were screwed. And so what that meant was they would have all these young teenagers that were enlisted. They'd have all these old men who were enlisted and, trying to fight to save their homes. But they were pretty screwed. This is a little bit more historically accurate painting. Holding the Line, the Confederates. This one by William Gilbert Gall. And this is the typical thing I read about in Gone with the Wind. Lots of these guys, they've got no shoes. They just try to wrap some rags around their foot as a shoe. They don't have any uniforms. They don't have hardly any equipment. A lot of them are throwing rocks. I mean, they were pathetic. They were incredibly brave, but they were also quite pathetic. And here's the reality. Sherman just comes in. He's got massive, overwhelming equipment and numbers of men, numerical superiority. And he says, we're going to get this war over with. Screw you guys. I'm just going to burn down your entire town. I don't care if my men are PE, your women. We don't care if we KI, LL, your babies. This is what we're going to do. And you're going to give us unconditional surrender. And that's it. And so that's also, that was Sherman. Okay, that's what he did to Atlanta. And that's what they did to a whole bunch of other cities. For no reason. They would just burn down the civilians' homes. They would brutalize them. It was really bad. It was disgraceful. It was embarrassing. If you read about it, you'll be shocked at how terrible the North was to the South. And even after it was over, they imposed martial law during Reconstruction, and then there was a whole carpetbagger scallywag thing where they did all kinds of tricks to just take away the Southerners' homes. They wouldn't let them vote. It's much worse than what most people know. Okay, now here's a nice painting by Winslow Homer. This one is Prisoners at the Front. Okay, so here is a Northern officer, and you can see a little bit of defiance in the young Southerner. The older guys are a little more cautious. You know, they don't even have a uniform. And anyways, this kind of symbolizes where things were going for the South. A lot, and when they get sent up north to prison, and Lincoln would refuse prisoner swaps because Lincoln's attitude is, look, they need replacements. We don't. We got tons of guys. So what if all the prisoners starve to death? It doesn't matter. In the long run, it serves our cause, the North. They didn't care at all about the individual soldiers. These guys, they would let them starve to death like crazy. Okay, at Appomattox, this is the final surrender of Robert E. Lee to Ulysses S. Grant. The war is over in 1865. And then I'll just show you a couple additional paintings. Here's General Grant and his generals. This one was commissioned by Northern leadership to Ole Hanson Bowling. Do you notice how this painting just sort of emanates fake? This is totally commissioned and paid for. So when there's a war, the winners, the victors, write the history book. So they just write themselves as the heroes, even though they went in and basically raped, looted and pillaged and burnt down another civilization. So it's quite extraordinary to read about this. And then here's another painting of the North. They call themselves the peacemakers, even though they totally started the war. Habeas corpus imprisoned tens of thousands of people with no trial. Basically censored all the newspapers, wouldn't let anybody write or say anything against his plans for the Civil War. Sherman was a total butcher. Sherman, not only after he got done with the South, they put him in charge of getting rid of the Indians, and he just massacred them. He specifically said all the American Indians should be massacred. We should exterminate all of them. That would be the easiest way to solve the problem. And he claimed it was being done to facilitate running the railroads. But what I'm trying to say, this guy was a psychopath, all right? He's not some type of hero, Sherman. He's an awful, evil piece of crap. Anyways, I just thought this Civil War art was interesting, and I'm getting ready to do a book review of Gone with the Wind. I already did the movie. I'm going to do the book. And it's such a long book that it's going to be probably in a couple parts. But I thought that might be interesting to you, these paintings. I thought the whole thing was rather interesting.